So, the other day I was standing in the hall and my friend walked up to me. You see, the thing about Jordan is she knows I have a thing about personal space, so she got really close to me, like nose to cheek close. I was so uncomfortable. Probably how you're feeling right now. And how I'm slightly feeling. But before we get any closer, we're going to look into what personal space actually is, how to know if you're invading someone's personal space, and look into how personal space changes by culture. But first, let's step up right next to the idea of what personal space actually is. According to Oxford Dictionary, personal space is the immediate physical surrounding into which any encroachment feels threatening to or uncomfortable for them. So as my friend got closer to me, I felt more uncomfortable, as you probably did as I got closer to you. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall describes 4 different levels of social distance. First is your intimate level, which expands off of you from 8 to 16 inches. Second, you have your personal space level, which expands off of you from 1.5 feet to 8 feet. Third, you have your social distance, which expands off of you from 8 to 12 feet. And finally, you have your public distance, which expands off of you from 12 to 25 feet in all directions. This is typically what every stranger should stay in, well, unless of course you're me, which I broke down all 4 levels and stepped right up into your personal space level. Neuroscientist Ralph Adolph did an experiment on a lady who had suffered severe brain damage to both sides of her amygdala. Through his studies, he discovered that she had no sense of personal space. He would tell her to get as close to the doctor until she felt uncomfortable, and she would go all the way up to them until she was almost touching him, not feeling uncomfortable at all. This is how we discovered that your amygdala is responsible for personal space. Now that we have a better understanding of what personal space really is, let's get really close to the idea of what your amygdala really does. Your amygdala doesn't just tell you that the person next to you is a little too close and you should probably move away because you're uncomfortable. Your amygdala is also in charge of processing your emotions, according to ScienceDaily.com. Autism is also linked to personal space. Your amygdala is also linked to fear and pleasure. Not every person with autism doesn't have a sense of personal space, but oftentimes the two are linked together. Another disability that is linked to your amygdala is post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes people with autism get too close to someone and make them feel uncomfortable, while sometimes people with PTSD get uncomfortable when someone gets close to them. It all just depends on the person and their amygdala. For example, some people on public transportation don't mind if they're leaning up against you or touching you, while other times people on the buses get very uncomfortable when you're a few steps away from them. It all just depends on the person and their amygdala. Now that we understand that your amygdala isn't just in charge of personal space, let's look into how personal space changes by culture. So imagine if me standing next to you wasn't a weird thing, and people stood that close to you all the time. Well, some cultures' sense of personal space is different from America's. Some people don't get the pleasure of personal space because they're always standing next to someone because there's so many people. For example, if we lived in New Delhi, there are 11 million people crammed into just 270 square miles. There is no way someone there is going to have a sense of personal space because they're always cramped next to someone. According to Boundless.com, they place one's sense of personal space at 2 feet on either side, 28 inches in the front, and 16 inches in the back for the average Westerner. So those living in places where there are not as many people, they aren't always as cramped. Those living in more densely populated areas tend to have a smaller sense of personal space. Now that we have a better understanding of how personal space changes by culture, let's take our final step and wrap ourselves in the idea of what personal space really is. Personal space, the weird imaginary bubble we surround ourselves in that when someone enters, we feel uncomfortable and immediately push them out. This was a pleasure I did not give to you today. You were not able to push me out of your personal space, and that probably made you feel very uncomfortable. Just remember that someone's sense of personal space halfway around the world is very different from yours because of the culture they were brought up in and their amygdala. So the next time you're on any form of public transportation, a busy hall, or a crowded store, just remember that everyone has their own sense of personal space.